to another episode of PoliTalks, and we will be continuing the 2024 United States Senate analysis series, and we will be broadening our focus not to just how the Senate map in 2024 is unfavorable to Democrats, but also we'll be looking in more nuance at various races, and I will be crafting my first prediction for the 2024 midterms fully fleshed out, all states with margins. And my hope with this is that I can continue this as a weekly recurring thing. And then by the end of the 2024 elections, when all is said and done, I can reflect back on this first prediction and see ultimately how much my expectations have shifted and how much the narrative has shifted, and whether my first prediction is either very similar or drastically different than the actual results come 2024. Although it is important to note we are far over. We are 1.5 years away, certainly even more from 2024 elections. So, of course, those are not in our mind right now, but they will be before we know it. And this is the first prediction I will be making. So, I've mentioned before how Democrats face a very unfavorable map with many states up that certainly are not too favorable for them or could be considered competitive. Although, like I said, let's balance realism here. Oftentimes, we may see, like, for example, many mentioned a good point, which is that in 2022, the narrative coming into the beginning of that election cycle was this is going to be a blowout. Republicans are going to easily win, and by massive margins in both the House and Senate. And of course, that very much fizzled out, and we saw a much more moderate outcome. And one last point I want to mention before I dive right on in here is that US politics tends to be a little more gray as opposed to black and white. So typically, while of course there is massive polarization in this country, that partly because of that even split and polarization, that is why we see such close election results, and why we'll probably won't see a blowout on the scale of, say, 2008. I think that is something from the past. So, without further ado, we will dive straight on in. And the first state I will be covering, this is the map I will be covering, and it does not have any special elections as of yet. If we look at the map on Wikipedia as well, no special elections. Typically, you will have at least 1 or 2 per cycle due to retirements, etc. Although we do not have any yet. So we will just jump right on in with Democrat safe states, because believe me, there aren't many of them. So we have Maryland, Connecticut. I would say I'm comfortable categorizing as safe. I don't think that state will pose any real threat to Democrats this cycle. Vermont, obviously, my goodness, I am getting confused now between Vermont and New Hampshire, which is very undesirable. Okay, so there we go. And we will see, we have Hawaii, of course, and California. Now, California is an interesting. I actually want to dive more into this race because, of course, it's not competitive when we're talking Democrat versus Republican. But when we're talking Democrat versus Democrat, this is an interesting dynamic because two candidates are already announcing their intention to run in this race, and they are high-profile candidates, and those are Katie Porter, a U.S. representative for California's 47th district, and another U.S. representative for California's 30th district, Adam Schiff, who you may have heard about in the recent Congress, for his disputes with Kevin McCarthy regarding committee positions. But the interesting thing about these candidacies is similar to what we're seeing in the Arizona race happening right now. We are seeing a lot of candidates throwing their hat in very early in the race, and that is presumably in an attempt to choke out the incumbent United States Senator in the state, who is Dianne Feinstein. And I think that Dianne Feinstein, she is in her 80s, and personally, I think that she will probably retire this cycle. I would be very surprised if she ran for another term, because really, she will face a lot of pressure to step down in this race and allow younger generations to take over. Democrats have been quietly removing her from top committee positions due to perceived signs of a loss in mental acuity. So we will see what happens in this race, although it's certainly possible Dianne Feinstein could run, and considering the support she's amassed in the past, it wouldn't be impossible to see her win this race, although considering the sheer amount of candidates that have already run, and the way California works is there's a top two, uh, they call it a blanket primary. So in the primary election, actually, you have all the candidates on one ballot. The top two vote getters move on to the general election, which is only between the top two. So what that means is, considering Republicans amass very little support here in California, it's not impossible to think that perhaps one of these alternate candidates will be face to face if Dianne Feinstein decides to run with Dianne Feinstein. And that would be really interesting to see how California chooses between an older, typically more establishment associated versus a younger, newer generation Democrat. Although I do think that the latter would win, and I don't expect Dianne Feinstein will run for another term here, and it probably will not be a great move for her political future, or should I say her future in general, considering her advanced age. But that is one of the most interesting safe states on this list, and there are not many others. Washington, I will characterize as likely simply because in the past there's been some uncertainty, although I do not expect that will be competitive. Colorado is also a likely state, I would say. I don't think that, let's see, who's running? Hold on. My apologies. I think I might have yes, I do indeed have the wrong map up, so I will fix that real quick. But, funnily enough, I should really make sure I have the correct map. So that would be is it class 1 senators? Yes, it is class 1. My sincerest apologies, although some of these are still true. Okay, so we have discussed these. Vermont, Bernie Sanders. I actually should probably not mark that Democrat because technically it is an independent, although effectively they end up voting with the Democratic Party, so they are effectively a Democrat in all but name. Angus King is another one. Maine could be an interesting state. I'm teetering on the edge of lean and likely, though Angus King, I expect him possibly to run again, and if he does not, I still think another Democrat will take his place. Yes, Susan Collins has won in Maine, but she is rather an exception, and I don't think another Republican could really gain the same foothold she has right now. We've got Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, and we've got New York safe. A lot of these are very self-explanatory. There are a lot of Democratic safe states, simply a lot of Democratic states altogether. Virginia is probably likely, just considering recent results. I believe that is almost all. Yep, I think that is all the safe Democratic states. And I apologize, it's not show the number of Democrats there would be in the Senate total. Although, given that I think there are, so I think there are. Sorry, let me go to the main page. 33 of the 100 seats, and going into them, 20 seats up for Democrats, 11 seats for Republicans. So what that means is because they technically have, so doing a little math here, you can see that, so it appears that 28 Democrats would be up for re-election, so we can just use those numbers. So 28 Democrats plus 13 Democrats, that is 41 Democrats. So that is actually, shockingly, not that much. I think I might have got that. Perhaps I got that wrong, perhaps not. But that is certainly a disturbing number, given the fact that those are the likely and safe states, and we still have lean and tilts, which very much could go to Republicans. And then Republicans, simply, if we do the math on their side, a little simpler because they don't have any independents. So there will be 38 pre-existing Republicans that will not be up this cycle. So just add that to the Republican total I add here. So we have Wyoming. I nearly did my Montana by accident, which is a disturbing sign for Democrats. I think that is my default, although of course I will explore that later in the video. North Dakota, Nebraska, not competitive. New Mexico, I would say, is a likely state for Democrats, so you can bump that up to 42 for Democrats. Mississippi is safe, I'd say. So is Tennessee. So is Missouri, and Florida, I would say, is likely with Rick Scott. I will discuss this briefly. I would say Rick Scott is not the most popular and well-respected figure in Florida. He's certainly not on the level of Marco Rubio and Ron DeSantis, but given how much Florida has shifted the past few years, I'd be frankly very surprised if this is even in lean or tilt margin. So Florida is likely R, and Indiana, even though there was a retiring Republican incumbent, I would say that is still a uh, safe R state. So 9 Republicans plus 38 going in is 45 Republicans, which is a very good number for Republicans. And Texas, I would actually make the very controversial claim to say this is a lean state. And I say this because I think it will go by 4 or 5 points, which is right on the edge. But frankly, I think that Ted Cruz is not very popular in Texas, and I do expect him to run again. And Texas has been shifting recently a little bit, little by year, to the Democrats. So I actually think this race might be a little closer than expected. Still definitely a Republican hold. But assuming Ted Cruz does run again, I actually think he might fare reasonably poorly here compared to other Republicans in Texas. So this, believe it or not, puts the Republicans at 48 seats going into this election, which is a very bad news for Democrats. So 48 seats for Republicans. Of course, Minnesota is likely, or I would actually say lean. I'll just put that because of the same uncertainty factor this early on. So 15. And we can see that that would add up to, so assuming there are 28 pre-existing, that would mean 15 would be 43. Still not great for the Democrats. However, here's the slam dunk I'm going to make, is that all 3 of these states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, I would say are lean Democratic. Now, the reason I say this is because in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, I do think it is quite likely we'll see the popular incumbents running again. Those are popular incumbents. They have won in the past, and they are reasonably well respected, so I do expect them to win again. Michigan, the incumbent, is actually retiring, but given how well Democrats actually did in Michigan in the 2022 midterms, I think it is certainly feasible to say that this is a lean blue state as of this time. And that's a little better for Democrats. It puts them at 46 seats, but they still need to win all. Not getting this right. So they need this for 46 seats, and they need this. Yes, so here's the thing. The other funny thing coming into this election cycle is that Democrats actually, not even a 50-50 could be enough. If Ron DeSantis wins the presidency, they're going to need to keep all of their seats or have a net gain of 0, which I think will practically be impossible this year. So I'd say that's another reason this year is bad news for Democrats, is if, depending on the outcome of the presidency, Democrats might not even be able to lose a single seat. So that spells bad news for Democrats. But now we'll get into the real juicy states. And starting with Ohio, I'd say this one is a very slight but definite tilt Republican at this time. I do expect Sherrod Brown will run for re-election. Democrats in the past few years have really not been doing great in Ohio, and I think he will probably ultimately prevail, or he will ultimately face defeat in Ohio, just as Tim Ryan did, 2016 Democrats did, and in 2020 Joe Biden did. And I think that will be another unfortunate seat for Democrats, although it's certainly possible to regain. And unlike West Virginia, which will be a lean red state, I definitely think it is a little more likely to rain. West Virginia is I honestly, actually, I would say this is almost a likely Republican state. My reason being, I simply think Joe Manchin has not gotten lucky, but he has faced the last remaining favorable outburst of support for Democrats and his breed of Democrats in the state. And I think ultimately now the political winds will catch up to him, and he'll just have to acknowledge this is going to be a very difficult race for him to win. And already now, Republicans, I believe, according to these numbers, yes, I think that means that uh, they will win the majority, flipping two Democratic seats because all three of these seats are Democratic held, the remaining ones. So that would mean they would flip two seats, and regardless of the presidential outcome, that would be a loss for Democrats. But we still have these three seats left, and they're all very competitive, which is the problem for Democrats. There are too many competitive, too many right wing seats in this election. But we'll first start with Montana, which I also think is another. I would actually say lean red for Montana. Also, reasoning being, I think John Tester has gotten lucky with 2018, and this could be a very difficult election for him, frankly, given the leaning of the state and polarization, and the fact that Steve uh, Bullock was not able to even really come close in 2020. All of it is just a bad news sandwich for John Tester, and well, like Ohio, I think greater than West Virginia, Democrats could potentially hold on to the seat, but it would take a lot, especially considering all the other competitive seats. So now Democrats are in a really bad position, and Republicans have already gained three seats. But that would not be the worst of all worlds, a 52 to 48 Republican majority. They could probably win that back in 2026. Unless they win these two states, that would put them in a very, very poor position. But I think for both of these states, the result will be a tilt projection. And this is another one that I found somewhat difficult to characterize. But Nevada, I think, is really similar. It's a kind of, you can use it as an analogy for North Carolina of the Democrats. It almost appears to be competitive in almost every single election cycle it's in. The margin never really changes, but it's still very low. But like I said, I don't think Nevada will change. I think it's just slightly too Democratic leaning for Republicans to really make too much of an imprint in. I mean, if Republicans couldn't win with a decent candidate in 2022, a relatively poor incumbent in a year that really was supposed to favor Republicans, especially when the economy was doing very poorly, and Republicans still couldn't win here. I think that's a pretty bad indication for 2024. I think they're going to struggle to find those same circumstances, which is going to make it hard for them to win. Yet, I still acknowledge the reality of the uncertainty and the very possibility Nevada could shift red, so I will give it a tilt margin for now. Arizona, easily probably the most interesting state on this list, purely because it is a state where an independent is potentially running and a Democratic seat. So Kirsten Sinema has already filed paperwork for this race, and Ruben Gallego, a Democratic representative from Arizona, has already filed or has already declared his intention to run. And what that means is the reason he did this is to put pressure on Kirsten Sinema not to run in this race, because if they do, what's likely going to happen is because Kirsten Sinema and Ruben Gallego are both, roughly speaking, left leaning, they could potentially split the vote, allowing a third Republican challenger to sweep this race. And I've seen even polls showing that Carrie Lake would win a three-way matchup between these three. So I think it's going to be fascinating to see whether Kirsten Sinema ends up running. And I actually think she will. But I think still this race will end up going to Democrats. And my reasoning being is Democrats ultimately, the past few years, they've really shown their ability to be united in many ways. And I don't think they would let this race go to the Republicans because of a partisan conflict. So if we get to a point where we're nearing the election and it looks like there's a deadlock three-way race, I do believe that it will become actually a very similar dynamic to the House Speaker race um, of a few weeks prior, where it's essentially a game of who chickens out first, because someone has to chicken out eventually, unless it's to the detriment of the Democratic Party. But the question is who, and I think someone will. I ultimately think that someone will be Ruben Gallego. I think he'll eventually just have to admit this, because having a conservative Democrat is far better than having a ultra conservative Republican in the seat. So I think that eventually Democrats will get this act together, and I think there's a good chance Kirsten Sinema doesn't run, and she's just fed up with the Senate. And in that case, I still think just the shifts we've seen in Arizona over the past few years. Yes, you could still classify it as a red state, but I think in a two-way race between a Democrat and a Republican, 9 times out of 10, I think this year the Democrat wins. So that concludes my final results of the 2022, my mind is still stuck in 2022, the 2024 midterm elections. Not midterm, like I said, still stuck in 2022. Why don't I just say 2024 Senate elections? And those are my preliminary predictions, 1 week out. Hope to do another episode each week. And that concludes it today. The final recap is 3 states, ultimately not a huge surprise. Basically, the results of this election, every seat that Joe Biden won in 2020, uh, Democrats will win, and same goes with the seats that President Trump won in 2020 as well. So Montana, Ohio, and West Virginia would flip, and that would leave the Democrats with a 48 to 52 minority in the Senate, which of course would be bad news for them. But they had a very unfavorable map this year, so it wouldn't be the worst result for Democrats certainly, and they have a lot to lose this election, so it'll be fascinating to see how that plays out. I will see you very soon in another episode of PoliTalks. Bye.